The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the quiet neighborhood as Robert drove home. After spending the morning helping younger vets at the community center, his body ached a bit, but his heart felt full. 25 years in the Army had taught him the value of giving back. The red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror without warning. Robert checked his speed. He wasn't speeding. He carefully pulled over, turning down the soft jazz playing on the radio. No big deal, he thought. Probably just a routine check. As he waited for the officer to approach, Robert did what he always did, placed his hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. Old habits from too many stories shared among his black veteran friends. The officer took his time, making Robert wait nearly 5 minutes before approaching. When he finally reached the window, Officer Keller didn't ask for license and registration first like they usually do. "You people never stop at stop signs, do you?" the officer said, his voice hard and cold. Robert blinked, confused. "Excuse me, officer. Did I miss a stop sign back there?" "Don't play dumb with me. I saw you roll right through it." Officer Keller's hand rested on his holster, his stance aggressive. "License and registration." "Yes, sir. My wallet is in my back pocket, and my registration is in the glove box. I'm going to reach for them now," Robert explained calmly, movements deliberate and slow. As Robert reached toward the glove compartment, the officer suddenly drew his weapon. "Hands where I can see them." Robert froze, heart hammering against his ribs. "Officer, I was just—" "Shut up and put your hands on the wheel." Robert complied instantly, his combat training kicking in. "Stay calm. Don't escalate." "My registration is in the glove compartment, sir. You asked me to get it." A small crowd had begun to gather on the sidewalk. A woman across the street had her phone out, recording. Officer Keller noticed the onlookers but didn't holster his weapon. "Step out of the vehicle. Now." Rain had started to fall, light at first but quickly getting heavier. Robert carefully opened his door and stepped out, his bad knee stiff from sitting. The injury from his third tour still bothered him on rainy days. "I'm a retired Army surgeon, sir," Robert said quietly. 25 years of service." The officer scoffed. "Yeah, right. You expect me to believe they let you command anything." His emphasis on "you" made the real meaning clear. The small crowd grew as neighbors emerged from their homes. More phones appeared, recording the scene. "Spread your legs. Hands on the hood," Officer Keller barked. Robert complied, the cold rain now soaking through his shirt. His leg brace was visible beneath his jeans. "What's that? Some kind of weapon?" Officer Keller demanded, pointing at the brace. "No, sir, it's a knee brace. I was injured during deployment." "Sure you were," the officer muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Probably running from someone you robbed." Robert's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. The rain fell harder now, running down his face in cold streams. Officer Keller took his time searching the car, deliberately making a mess of Robert's neatly kept interior. He pulled out the small American flag Robert kept in his cup holder, a gift from a fellow soldier's child. "Plain patriot now." Officer Keller tossed the flag onto the wet ground. A woman in the crowd gasped. An older man shook his head. For 20 minutes, Robert stood in the pouring rain while Officer Keller searched his car. Finally, the officer emerged with a triumphant smile. "Well, well, looks like we have multiple violations here." He started writing tickets. Failure to stop at a stop sign, broken taillight, tinted windows exceeding legal limit. Robert knew his taillight worked perfectly. His windows weren't even tinted. "Sir, I believe there's been a mistake." "You calling me a liar?" Officer Keller stepped closer, his voice dropping dangerously. "You people always think you know better, don't you? Even the ones who play dress-up in our military." A young man from the crowd called out, "Hey, that's not right." Officer Keller spun around. "Anyone else want a citation today?" The crowd fell silent, but the phones kept recording. "Go back where you came from," Officer Keller said, slapping the stack of citations against Robert's chest. "Next time, stop at the sign." Robert stood in the rain, holding the soaked tickets as Officer Keller drove away. His shoulders remained straight, his dignity intact despite the humiliation. The combat veteran in him had faced worse. The American in him had expected better. What Robert didn't know was that a storm much bigger than the rain was about to break. The rain poured harder as Robert stood beside his car, watching Officer Keller deliberately take his time. Water dripped from Robert's gray temples down his neck, soaking his collar. His knee throbbed from standing so long in the cold rain, but he kept his back straight, the way he had during countless military inspections. "I'm going to need to check your trunk now," Officer Keller announced, twirling his keychain around his finger. A small smile played on his lips as he glanced at the growing crowd of onlookers. "May I ask why, sir?" Robert's voice remained steady despite the chill creeping through his bones. "You questioning police procedure." Officer Keller stepped closer, his face inches from Robert's. "That's suspicious behavior right there." A middle-aged woman across the street called out, "He's just standing there." "Leave him alone." Officer Keller spun around. "Ma'am, stay back or you'll be interfering with police business." He turned back to Robert, voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Your kind always has something to hide." Robert's jaw tightened, but 25 years of military discipline held his tongue. He stepped aside, allowing access to his trunk. The officer made a show of searching through Robert's neatly packed trunk, tossing aside his folded American Legion jacket, dumping out his gym bag, and scattering the contents of his first aid kit across the wet pavement. "Look at this," Officer Keller said loudly, holding up a small pocket knife from Robert's emergency kit. "Concealed weapon." "That's standard in any emergency kit, officer." Robert pointed to the Red Cross symbol on the scattered kit. 3 inches, completely legal. "You a lawyer now?" Officer Keller laughed, writing another citation. The crowd had grown to about 15 people, most with phones recording. Some were live streaming. Robert noticed an elderly white couple watching from their porch, the man leaning heavily on his cane. The old man shook his head in disgust, not at Robert, but at the officer's behavior. "Sir, I've cooperated fully," Robert said. "I'd like to know specifically what violations I'm being cited for." Officer Keller's face darkened. "On the ground." "Now." "Excuse me." "I said on the ground. Hands behind your back." "Officer, I don't understand." Before Robert could finish, Officer Keller grabbed his shoulder and pushed him down. Robert's bad knee buckled as he hit the wet pavement. Pain shot up his leg as his knee brace twisted awkwardly. "Stop resisting," Officer Keller shouted, though Robert wasn't fighting back. "I'm not resisting," Robert said through gritted teeth. "My knee. I have a combat injury." "Sure you do." Officer Keller pressed his knee into Robert's back, pushing his face close to the wet pavement. "Probably got injured running from the cops back in the day." A young man stepped forward from the crowd. "Hey, he's wearing a visible leg brace. You can't do this." "Stay back," Officer Keller barked. He leaned down close to Robert's ear. "Your type doesn't belong in our military. Stolen valor is what that is." The pain in Robert's knee was becoming unbearable, but he focused on his breathing the way his army doctor had taught him. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. Officer Keller finally pulled Robert to his feet, making no effort to be gentle with the injured knee. Robert winced but remained silent. 5 citations, Officer Keller announced, slapping the stack of papers against Robert's chest. Failure to stop, broken taillight, excessive window tinting, concealed weapon, and resisting an officer. "None of those are true," Robert said quietly. "Your word against mine." Officer Keller smirked, tapping his badge. "Guess whose matters more?" What Officer Keller didn't realize was that in his arrogance, he'd forgotten about his body camera. Every word, every action, every unnecessary cruelty was being recorded, not just by the bystanders, but by the department's own equipment. "You've got 30 days to pay these fines," Officer Keller said. "Though your kind usually just skips town, right?" Robert took the soaked citations with dignity. "I've faced enemy fire for this country, sir. I don't run." Something in Robert's tone made Officer Keller pause briefly before recovering his sneer. "Get back in your car and go back where you came from." As Robert carefully lowered himself into his driver's seat, he noticed a business card slipped under his windshield wiper. Someone from the crowd had left it there while the officer was busy writing tickets. It read, "Civil Rights Attorney." Officer Keller finally returned to his patrol car, satisfied with his display of power. As he drove away, The crowd moved toward Robert, offering help, sharing their videos, expressing their outrage. What none of them knew was that before the sun rose tomorrow, those videos would reach people with the power to change everything. Officer Keller's day of reckoning was already in motion. By midnight, the videos were everywhere. People across the country woke up to their phones buzzing with notifications about a black veteran being mistreated by a police officer. The clearest video, shot by a college student named Tina, had already reached 2 million views. Robert sat at his kitchen table, staring at his phone in disbelief. His knee was wrapped in ice, still throbbing from being forced to the ground. He hadn't planned to tell his daughter about what happened. She had enough on her plate as a single mom and busy attorney. But now she was calling for the 5th time. He finally answered, "Dad, why didn't you call me right away?" Her voice was tight with worry and anger. "I had to find out from my paralegal who saw it on social media." "I didn't want to bother you with this mess," Robert said, rubbing his tired eyes. "Bother me? Dad, this is what I do. This is literally my job." Papers rustled in the background as she spoke. "I've already started gathering witness statements. 3 people from the scene contacted our firm directly." Robert sighed. "Honey, I just want this to blow over." "It's not going to blow over, Dad. Not this time." As if to prove his daughter's point, Robert's doorbell rang. Outside stood Mrs. Chen from across the street, holding a casserole dish. Behind her were at least a dozen neighbors, some he recognized, others he'd never met. "We saw what happened," Mrs. Chen said simply. "No one should be treated that way, especially someone who served our country." Throughout the day, a steady stream of visitors arrived. Fellow veterans from the community center came by, including retired Colonel Thompson, who had served with Robert years ago. "This isn't just about you anymore, old friend," the colonel said, his weathered face serious. "It's about every man and woman who wore the uniform only to come home and face this kind of disrespect." Robert's phone kept ringing. Local news wanted statements, veteran groups offered support, and strangers called to express outrage. By evening, his living room had become an impromptu command center. His daughter had brought her laptop and legal pads, working from the couch while giving directions to colleagues over the phone. 2 young veterans were helping organize the incoming messages and offers of support. "There's going to be a gathering at the police station tomorrow," one of them told Robert. Peaceful, respectful, but making it clear this community won't stand for what happened. Robert frowned. "I don't want trouble." "No trouble," his daughter assured him. "Just accountability." On the local evening news, the reporter stood outside the police station. The department has issued a brief statement saying they're looking into the incident, but community leaders are demanding more. They want an investigation into Officer Keller's conduct and a review of department policies. The camera cut to a young black woman organizing the community response. "This isn't an isolated incident. This is a pattern. And we have the receipts now." Later that night, after everyone had gone, Robert sat alone in his living room. His military medals and photos hung on the wall, moments when his country had recognized his service. The contrast between those honors and today's humiliation stunned deeply. His phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. "Sir, I was there today. I'm a rookie officer in training. What happened to you was wrong. Some of us in the department want to speak up." Before Robert could respond, another message appeared. "Please don't share this. I could lose my job. But you should know. Officer Keller's body cam footage has been secured. It won't accidentally get deleted." Robert stared at the message for a long time, unsure how to feel about this anonymous ally within the department. The next morning, Robert woke to find nearly 100 people gathered peacefully on his front lawn. Many were veterans in their service caps. Others were community members holding handmade signs, "Respect our veterans" and "Accountability now." A news van parked across the street. A reporter approached, microphone extended. "Sir, do you have a statement about what happened yesterday?" All eyes turned to Robert as he stood in his doorway. He'd rehearsed no speech, planned no public appearance. For a moment, he considered closing the door and letting his daughter handle it all. Instead, he straightened his back, the way he had for 25 years in uniform. "I don't want revenge," he said, his voice clear and steady. "I want respect, not just for me, but for every person who gets pulled over in this town." I want officers who protect and serve everyone equally." His words were measured, thoughtful. No anger, no calls for punishment, just simple dignity and a request for fairness. The crowd erupted in applause. What Robert didn't know was that across town, the police chief was watching this interview live, body camera footage from Officer Keller's chest playing on another screen. The chief's face darkened as the two versions of reality, Robert's composed dignity versus Officer Keller's recorded behavior, played side by side. The wheels of justice had begun to turn. Police Chief Richards sat at his desk, rubbing his temples. The stack of complaint forms in front of him had grown since morning. His phone hadn't stopped ringing. Reporters camped outside the station, and his email inbox overflowed with messages from concerned citizens and angry veterans groups. "How bad is the body camera footage?" he asked Lieutenant Powell, who stood by the window watching the growing crowd of protesters outside. "Bad," Powell said simply. "Everything the witnesses claimed and then some. The audio is especially damning." Chief Richards sighed heavily, and Keller's record. Powell placed another folder on the desk. "This is what we could find. 3 complaints buried over the last 2 years. All similar situations, all involving minority drivers. All mysteriously marked as resolved with no further action. Who signed off on these?" The chief flipped through the pages, his frown deepening. "That's another problem, sir. Captain Mason." Chief Richards leaned back in his chair. Captain Mason, his right-hand man and longtime friend. The pieces were starting to fit together. Across town, Officer Keller sat in his living room, beer in hand, watching the news coverage with growing irritation. "It's been blown completely out of proportion," he told his partner. "Guy was being suspicious. I did my job." "The department put you on administrative leave, Brad," she said quietly. "That doesn't happen for nothing." "It's all politics," he snapped. "They're just covering themselves because some bleeding hearts posted videos online." His phone buzzed with a text from Captain Mason. "Say nothing to anyone. Lawyer up. I'll handle internal affairs." Officer Keller smiled, his confidence returning. Captain Mason had always had his back. What neither of them knew was that internal affairs wasn't handling this investigation. Chief Richards had called in the state police to conduct an independent review. At the state police headquarters, Detective Grace Wong reviewed the evidence methodically. The body camera footage played on her computer screen for the 3rd time. She paused at Officer Keller's comment about "your kind" and "stolen valor," making another note in her already extensive file. A knock at her door interrupted her work. A young officer entered with a USB drive. "You need to see this," he said. "We pulled footage from Officer Keller's previous stops. There's a pattern." Detective Wong inserted the drive and clicked on the first video. The similarities were striking: unnecessary aggression, targeted comments, excessive force, all directed at minority drivers. "How many?" she asked. 17 documented incidents in the last year alone. Meanwhile, Robert sat in his daughter's law office, surrounded by volunteers taking phone calls. More witnesses had come forward, not just from his incident but from previous encounters with Officer Keller. "Mr. Washington." A young woman approached Robert. "I'm from the state police. Detective Wong would like to speak with you when you have a moment." Robert followed her to a quiet conference room where Detective Wong waited with a recorder and notepad. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Washington," she said. "I know you've told this story several times already, but I need to hear it directly from you." Robert recounted the events once more: the stop, the search, the humiliation, the physical force despite his visible knee brace. Detective Wong listened carefully, asking clarifying questions without judgment. "One last thing," she said when he finished. "We've discovered other incidents involving Officer Keller. Would you be willing to join a larger case against him and potentially the department?" Robert hesitated. "I don't want to cause trouble. I just want this kind of thing to stop happening." "That's precisely why we need your help," Detective Wong explained. "Your military record, your calm demeanor on camera, and your measured public response make you a credible witness. This could help create real change." Back at the police station, Chief Richards called Captain Mason into his office. "Shut the door," the chief said coldly. Captain Mason entered, his usual confident smile in place. "If this is about Keller, I've got it under control. We'll issue a standard statement, put him on desk duty for a few weeks, and wait for this to blow over. The chief slid a folder across his desk. Explain these. Captain Mason's smile faded as he recognized the complaint forms he buried. There's more, the chief continued. State police found 17 similar incidents in the past year involving Keller. All signed off by you, all buried. It's not what it looks like, Captain Mason began. It's exactly what it looks like, the chief cut him off. Corruption, cover-ups, and encouraging a toxic officer. As of this moment, you're also on administrative leave pending investigation. Captain Mason's face hardened. You can't do this, the union. The union has already seen the evidence, Chief Richards interrupted. They've dropped their support for both you and Keller. Across town, Officer Keller's confidence was crumbling. His phone buzzed with a message from his union representative. Can't represent you on this one. Evidence too damaging. Suggest you get private counsel immediately. Minutes later, another text arrived, this time from Captain Mason. You're on your own. They know everything. Officer Keller's partner watched his face change as he read the messages. What's happening? She asked. They're hanging me out to dry, he whispered, his arrogance finally giving way to fear. All of them. What Officer Keller didn't yet know was that the worst revelation was still to come, a connection to his past that would change everything. Chief Richards stayed late at the office, reviewing Robert Washington's military record. 25 years of exemplary service, 3 combat tours, numerous commendations. The man Officer Keller had pushed to the wet pavement was a decorated hero. The chief paused at a particular commendation, reading it twice. Something about it rang a bell. He pulled out his phone and called an old army buddy who now worked at Veterans Affairs. Hey Tom, I need some information about an operation in Afghanistan around 2003. A rescue mission near Kandahar. After a long pause, the chief's face changed completely. You're absolutely sure about this? Another pause. Send me everything you've got. An hour later, Chief Richards stared at his computer screen in disbelief. The connection was undeniable. In his 20 years of police work, he'd never seen anything like this. At his apartment across town, Officer Keller was packing a bag. His phone had been ringing nonstop, reporters, fellow officers, even his mother. He ignored them all, throwing clothes into a duffel bag. Maybe his cousin in Ohio would let him crash for a while until this blew over. A firm knock at the door froze him in place. Police, open up. Not his colleagues, state police. Officer Keller considered his options, then reluctantly opened the door. Detective Wong stood there with 2 uniformed officers. Bradley Keller, we need you to come with us to answer some questions. Am I under arrest? He asked, his voice smaller than he intended. Not at this time, but I strongly suggest you cooperate. Detective Wong's expression gave nothing away. At the station, Officer Keller sat in an interview room, fidgeting with his watch. Chief Richards entered, carrying a thick folder. I thought state police was handling this, Keller said. They are. The chief placed the folder on the table. But before they continue, there's something you need to know, something personal. Keller crossed his arms defensively. I've got nothing to say without my lawyer. This isn't about your case. It's about your brother, David. Keller's arms slowly uncrossed. His younger brother David had served in Afghanistan years ago. What about him? Chief Richards opened the folder and slid a military photo across the table. It showed a group of soldiers, dusty and exhausted but smiling. Recognize anyone? Keller picked up the photo. That's David, second from the right. So what? Look at the man on the far left. Keller squinted at the photo. A tall black soldier stood slightly apart from the group, his arm in a sling. I don't know him. That's Sergeant Robert Washington, the man you detained, humiliated, and physically assaulted 3 days ago. Keller's face showed nothing at first, then confusion. What's your point? Chief Richards slid another document across the table, a mission report. Your brother's unit was pinned down outside Kandahar. Heavy fire, no extraction possible. They were given up for lost until a special operations team volunteered for a rescue. The chief tapped the photo. Sergeant Washington led that team. He took a bullet pulling your brother from the wreckage of their transport. Keller's face drained of color. That's not. David never said. He told your family a soldier named Rob saved his life. You never asked for details, did you? The chief's voice was even controlled. You never asked what Rob looked like. In his living room across town, Robert sat with his daughter and grandson, trying to maintain a normal evening despite the chaos of the past few days. His phone rang, the state police detective again. Mr. Washington, we've made some progress in the investigation, but there's something else you should know. Detective Wong's voice was carefully neutral. It's about Officer Keller's brother, David. Robert's expression softened at the name. David Keller? From the Kandahar rescue. Yes, sir, you know him. Of course. Brave young man. Got caught in a bad situation but kept his unit alive until we could reach them. Robert paused. What about him? Sir, Officer Bradley Keller is David Keller's older brother. The room went silent. Robert closed his eyes, pieces falling into place. Does he know? About the connection. He does now. Back at the station, Officer Keller sat alone, the photo and documents spread before him. His entire body seemed to have deflated. The door opened and Detective Wong entered with another folder. Officer Keller, we've found evidence of systematic bias in your policing. 17 incidents in the past 12 months that show a clear pattern. Keller barely seemed to hear her. He kept staring at the photo of his brother with the man he humiliated. The district attorney is considering charges, Detective Wong continued. However, there's something else you should see. She opened her folder and placed a handwritten letter on the table. Your brother sent this to Sergeant Washington a month after the rescue. Sergeant Washington kept it all these years. Keller picked up the letter with unsteady hands. His brother's handwriting was unmistakable. Rob, I'm alive because of you. Mom cried when I told her what you did. Dad said he'd never be able to repay you. I won't forget. Whatever you need, ever just ask. Your brother-in-arms, David. Something broke inside Bradley Keller. 20 years of built-up prejudice collided with the undeniable reality that his own brother owed his life to Robert Washington. The man he treated like dirt had saved his family from grief. Detective Wong watched the realization wash over him. Your brother has been contacted. He's flying in tomorrow. Keller looked up, his face ashen. Does he know what I did? Yes. Outside the station, reporters gathered as Chief Richards prepared to make a statement. The case had grown beyond one traffic stop into an investigation of systemic problems within the department. What no one yet realized was that this connection between Officer Keller and Robert Washington would transform not just the investigation, but the entire community's approach to healing the divide between police and citizens. 2 weeks after the traffic stop that changed everything, Officer Bradley Keller sat alone in his apartment. Empty takeout containers littered the coffee table. The TV played in the background, but he wasn't watching. His police badge lay on the kitchen counter where he'd tossed it after being officially terminated from the force yesterday. His phone rang, his brother David again. Bradley let it go to voicemail. David had called every day since flying in last week, but Bradley couldn't face him. Couldn't face the disappointment, the anger, the questions. The doorbell rang. Bradley ignored it. Then came a pounding on the door. I know you're in there, Brad. Open up or I'll use my key. Bradley sighed. He'd forgotten David still had a spare key from when he'd stayed here during his last leave. Reluctantly, he opened the door. David stood there, looking so much like their father it was startling. His military haircut was growing out, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. You look terrible, David said, pushing past his brother and entering the apartment. He wrinkled his nose at the smell. When's the last time you took out the trash? Bradley shrugged, closing the door. What do you want, David? What do I want? David's voice rose. I want my brother to explain why he treated a war hero, the man who saved my life, like garbage. I want to understand how my own flesh and blood could become everything we were taught to stand against. Bradley slumped onto the couch. I didn't know it was him. Would it have mattered? David demanded. If you'd known he was the guy who pulled me out of that transport under heavy fire, would you have treated him any differently? Or would you still have seen just another black man to harass? The question hung in the air. Bradley had asked himself the same thing every night since learning the truth. Across town, Robert sat in his daughter's kitchen, helping his grandson with math homework. The boy had been quiet lately, watching his grandfather with worried eyes. Does it still hurt? The boy asked suddenly, pointing to Robert's knee. "Just a little," Robert assured him. "I've had worse." "Why did that police officer hurt you? Were you doing something bad?" Robert put down his pencil and turned to face his grandson fully. How to explain something so complex to a 10-year-old? "Sometimes," he began carefully, "people judge others without knowing them. They make up their minds based on what someone looks like instead of who they really are." "That's stupid," the boy declared. Robert smiled sadly. "Yes, it is. But it happens. The important thing is how we respond." He tapped his grandson's homework. "Now, back to these fractions." His daughter entered, phone in hand. "Dad, the district attorney called. They're filing charges against Officer Keller. Criminal charges, not just departmental." Robert frowned. "What kind?" "Assault, official oppression, civil rights violations." She hesitated. "The DA wants to make an example of him. They're talking about a press conference, asking you to speak." Robert shook his head. "I don't want to be part of a circus." "This isn't a circus, Dad. This is accountability." At the police station, Chief Richards faced the department's officers. The room was tense, silent. "As of today, Captain Mason has resigned. Officer Keller has been terminated. But that's just the beginning." The chief's voice was stern. "We're implementing new training protocols, body camera reviews, and a civilian oversight committee." A veteran officer raised his hand. "Chief, with all due respect, this seems like an overreaction to one bad apple." "One bad apple?" The chief's eyebrows rose. "We found 17 similar incidents from Keller alone, and who knows how many more were never reported or were buried by Captain Mason." He pointed to a stack of files. "Every one of these cases will be reviewed. Every officer who turned a blind eye will be accountable. This isn't about one bad apple. This is about a culture that allowed that apple to rot in the first place." Back at Bradley's apartment, the brothers sat in strained silence. Finally, David spoke. "You're facing criminal charges." Bradley nodded dully. "My lawyer says I'll probably do time." "You should." David's voice was hard. "But that's not why I'm here." He pulled out his phone and showed Bradley a text message. "Robert Washington wants to meet with you." Bradley looked up, shocked. "Why would he want that?" "I don't know. But if I were you, I'd take the opportunity." David stood to leave. "He showed mercy pulling me out of that transport. Maybe he's offering some kind of mercy now." David paused at the door. "You know what's ironic? When I got back from that deployment, I told you about the black surgeon who saved me. You said you wished you could thank him someday." His laugh was bitter. "Well, you got your chance, didn't you?" The door closed behind him, leaving Bradley alone with the weight of his brother's words. The next morning, the local newspaper's headline read, "Police Department announces overhaul following veteran incident." Below was a photo of Robert in his military uniform from years ago, standing tall and proud. Bradley stared at the image for a long time. The man in that photo had risked everything to save his brother, and Bradley had pushed that same man face down into the wet pavement. The disconnect was impossible to reconcile. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Mr. Keller, this is Robert Washington. I believe we should talk. Your brother gave me your number. Tomorrow, 2 p.m., Veterans Center. Come alone." Bradley read the message 3 times, his heart pounding. It wasn't a request from a victim. It sounded more like an order from a sergeant. For the first time in 2 weeks, Bradley Keller took a shower, shaved, and put on clean clothes. He had less than 24 hours to figure out what to say to the man whose life he had destroyed, and who, years ago, had saved his family from grief. What he didn't know was that Robert Washington had a proposal that would change both their lives forever. Bradley Keller arrived at the Veterans Center 20 minutes early. He sat in his car, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm his racing heart. The building looked ordinary. Brick exterior, American flag out front, a small sign identifying it as a place where those who served could find support. For Bradley, it felt like walking into enemy territory. He finally gathered the courage to enter at exactly 2 p.m. The front desk volunteer, an older man with a Vietnam veteran cap, looked him over with undisguised contempt. Word had gotten around. "Robert's waiting in the back office," the man said coldly. Bradley followed the directions down a hallway lined with military photos and service emblems. He paused at one display. a shadow box containing medals and a faded photo of a much younger Robert in desert camouflage standing with his unit. The bronze star with Valor device caught Bradley's eye. He'd never earned anything close to that. He knocked on the office door. "Come in," Robert's voice called. Bradley entered to find Robert sitting behind a desk, composed and dignified as he had been even while being mistreated in the rain. Beside him stood his daughter, arms crossed, expression guarded. "Thank you for coming," Robert said, gesturing to a chair. "This is my daughter, Lynn. She's an attorney." Bradley sat awkwardly. "I understand you're pressing charges." "I'm not here to discuss the legal case," Robert said. "That will proceed through proper channels. I wanted to meet with you for a different reason." Bradley braced himself, expecting well-deserved anger or a demand for a public apology. Instead, Robert slid a folder across the desk. "I'm starting a new program. I need your help." Bradley stared at the folder without opening it. "My help? Why would you want anything from me?" "Because," Robert said simply, "you're exactly what this program needs." He opened the folder and showed Bradley a proposal titled Brotherhood Beyond Borders, Police and Veterans Building Community Trust. "The police department needs to rebuild trust," Robert explained. "Veterans like me have leadership experience that can help. But we also need to understand the challenges officers face, and we need someone who's been on both sides of the problem." "Someone like me," Bradley said quietly. "A cautionary tale." "A perspective," Robert corrected. "You made terrible choices, but you also have a unique position now. You've seen how prejudice corrupts good policing. You've experienced the consequences. That's valuable." Lynn spoke up, her voice professionally detached. "The DA has agreed to consider community service as part of any plea deal. Participation in this program could qualify if you're genuine." Bradley looked from Lynn to Robert in disbelief. "You're offering me a chance to avoid jail?" "No," Robert said firmly. "I'm offering you a chance to make something meaningful out of your mistakes. Justice will still take its course." 6 months later, the community center auditorium was packed. On stage, Robert stood at a podium addressing an audience of police cadets, veterans, and community members. Behind him sat Chief Richards, Lynn, and several other program leaders. "Today marks the official launch of Brotherhood Beyond Borders," Robert announced. "In the past 6 months, our pilot program has trained 15 veterans to serve as community liaisons with the police department. We've held 12 workshops with officers to address unconscious bias and build cultural awareness." He paused, looking toward the back of the room. "We've also seen that redemption is possible, even after serious mistakes. Our next speaker knows this better than most." Bradley walked slowly to the stage. He looked different now, humbler, his face lined with the wisdom that only comes from facing hard truths. The audience murmured. Many recognized him from the news. "My name is Bradley Keller," he began, voice shaking slightly. 6 months ago, I was a police officer who abused my power. I hurt someone who didn't deserve it, someone who had once saved my brother's life." He gripped the podium. "I can't undo what I did. I faced legal consequences, as I should. But thanks to Robert Washington, I've also had the chance to face the prejudice inside me that led to my actions." Bradley looked out at the cadets in the audience. "When you put on that uniform, you'll have power. How you use it will define you. I used mine to tear down. Now I'm trying to use whatever influence I have left to build up." After the presentation, Robert and Bradley stood together speaking with a group of young officers. What had begun as an unlikely alliance had slowly evolved into something resembling respect, if not quite friendship. The cadets seemed receptive, Robert observed as the group dispersed. Bradley nodded. "They're young. Mine's still open. Unlike yours was?" Robert asked with a hint of a smile. "Unlike mine was," Bradley agreed. Robert's grandson ran up, excitement on his face. "Grandpa, I showed the police officers your medals. They said you're a hero." Robert lifted the boy. "Everyone can be a hero in their own way. Sometimes it means running into danger to save others. Sometimes," he glanced at Bradley, "it means facing the hardest person to change, yourself." Later that evening, as the sun set over the community center, Robert and Bradley sat on a bench outside. The program launch had been a success, but both men knew their work was just beginning. Your brother called yesterday, Robert said. He's being deployed again next month. Bradley nodded. He told me. We're talking again. Not like before, but it's something. Healing takes time, Robert said. For families, for communities. A police cruiser drove slowly past the center. The officer inside, one of the department's new hires, nodded respectfully to both men. 6 months ago, I wouldn't have believed this was possible, Bradley admitted. 6 months ago, I was face down on wet pavement because of you, Robert reminded him, his voice matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. Bradley winced. I know, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for that. No, Robert shook his head. You'll spend the rest of your life moving forward, doing better. That's the point. We don't erase the past. We learn from it, then build a different future. As dusk settled around them, Robert Washington and Bradley Keller sat together, not as victim and aggressor, not as black and white, not as veteran and ex-cop, but as two men working to heal wounds larger than themselves. It wasn't a perfect ending. Bradley still faced consequences for his actions. Robert still carried the memory of that rainy day. The community still had deep divides to bridge, but it was a beginning. And sometimes beginnings are enough.